Организация Объединенных Наций родилась из ужаса самой кровопролитной войны в мировой истории. Ее главной целью было сделать так, чтобы она никогда не повторилась. Для этого организация закрепила свои основополагающие принципы во Всеобщей декларации прав человека. В ней было закреплено базовое соглашение. Все люди рождаются свободными и равными в своем достоинстве и правах. Под руководством этой организации и благодаря принятию этих идей человечество пережило самый продолжительный период глобального мира в истории за последние 70 лет, что также совпал с периодом наибольшего экономического роста в истории. Был создан международный форум, где страны могли урегулировать свои конфликты путем сотрудничества, а не прибегать к мгновенному применению оружия. Было достигнуто нечто немыслимое. 5 крупнейших мировых держав навсегда сели за один стол переговоров, причем каждая из них имела равное право вето, несмотря на абсолютно противоположные интересы. Все это не привело к исчезновению бедствий войны, но на данный момент обеспечило отсутствие эскалации конфликтов до глобальных масштабов. В результате менее чем за 40 лет мы прошли путь от 2 мировых войн, унесших в общей сложности более 120 миллионов жизней, до 70 лет относительного мира и глобальной стабильности, под покровом порядка, который позволял всему миру процветать. Ведь там, где есть торговля, нет пуль, как говорил Бастиан. Потому что торговля гарантирует мир, свобода гарантирует торговлю, а равенство перед законом гарантирует свободу. То, о чем писал пророк Исаия, и что вы читаете в парке напротив, уже исполнилось. Бог будет судить между народами и будет арбитром для многих народов. Они выкуют свои мечи во многих народах. Ни одна нация не поднимет меч против нации. Они никогда больше не узнают войны. Именно это в основном и произошло под эгидой Организации Объединенных Наций в первые десятилетия ее существования. И с этой точки зрения мы говорим о выдающемся успехе в истории наций, который нельзя игнорировать. Но в какой-то момент, как это обычно бывает с большинством бюрократических структур, созданных нами, людьми, эта организация перестала обеспечивать принципы, изложенные в ее учредительных актах, и начала мутировать. Организация, которая изначально задумывалась как щит для защиты прав людей, превратилась в многощупальцевого левиафана, стремящегося решать не только то, что должно делать каждое национальное государство, но и то, как должны жить все граждане мира. Таким образом, мы прошли путь от организации, которая стремилась к миру, до организации, которая навязывает своим членам идеологическую повестку дня по целому ряду вопросов, составляющих жизнь человека в обществе. Успешная модель Организации Объединенных Наций, истоки которой восходят к идеям президента Вильсона о мирном обществе без победы, и которая была основана
This graph shows that after the Second World War, the income of the average European has gotten closer and closer to that of the average American in dollar terms. However, after the crisis of 2008, that picture has changed, as European incomes stagnated while that of Americans continued to rise. This has led to alarming reports by financial media that Europeans are getting poorer and Americans richer. And while some of that can be explained by Europeans working less, a new report by arguably Europe's most famous economist, Mario Draghi, claims that the main problem is that Europeans have become 20% less productive compared to Americans. This economic stagnation is a major threat to Europe's prosperity because it will prevent European governments from making much needed investments to deal with a rapidly aging population and increased outside threats. However, as a European economist who acknowledges that this chart is very real, I still had a nagging suspicion that a crucial piece of the puzzle was missing, because whenever I make videos about Western economies, it's usually the Americans that are complaining about the state of their economy, not Europeans. Of course, me just looking at my comments is hardly scientific. But when I inspected typical quality of life statistics, such as the Human Development Index, life expectancy at birth, and self-reported happiness, which normally correlate consistently with GDP per person, this supposed massive impoverishment of Europeans versus Americans does not show up at all. This really got me wondering, what's going on? Did Europeans find the secret to having a good life without having money? No, the problem is that using this specific measure of GDP that almost everyone uses is very misleading, at least when it comes to comparing how rich Europeans are to Americans. To understand why, let's do a quick review of how economists compare economies. Well, economists have long been looking for an alternative. As of today, gross domestic product, or GDP for short, is still considered the best metric to compare how well off people in different countries are. In essence, GDP measures the value of all final goods and services produced in a specific country or region in a year. Now, while that misses a lot of economic activity, GDP actually tends to correlate really well with all sorts of different quality of life metrics. But while, for example, life expectancy in terms of years lived can easily be compared between two countries, GDP cannot, because countries often use a different unit of account for GDP. That is, the value of British goods and services are measured in British pounds, and while the Europeans mostly use euros and Americans use dollars. Of course, the easiest way to compare economies that use different currencies is to just use today's exchange rate to, for example, convert Europe's euro GDP to Europe's dollar GDP. Indeed, this is exactly how this graph was produced by economists at the World Bank. And just to be clear, there's nothing wrong with that. In fact, when I compare economies on this channel, I most often use GDP in dollar terms, simply because the US dollar is the world currency. So if your GDP drops in terms of US dollars, your citizens have genuinely become poorer from a global perspective. That is, they can now buy less stuff on international markets. So if, for example, we want to compare the international power of two small open economies that trade a lot with each other in different currencies, dollar term GDP is, in my opinion, the best metric that we have. However, GDP measured in US dollars is less useful if we want to compare American incomes to those in Europe. You see, in such large economic blocks, only a small fraction of goods and services are actually traded across borders. For example, in the US, total imports were just 15% of GDP in 2022. On top of that, for many goods and services, transportation costs are so high that it is extremely difficult to trade them across borders, even if such products or services would be much cheaper in a neighboring country. For example, if I go to the local hairdresser here in Belgium, I pay 15 euros to get this specific haircut, and it is worth every penny in my opinion. Which is good because while I live fairly close to the Dutch border, traveling to the nearest Dutch hair salon would be way more expensive than 15 euros, especially if I take into consideration travel time. This is why economists often use getting a haircut as an example of a non-tradable good or service, where transportation costs are so high that international trade does not make sense at all. As you can imagine, the bigger a country or region is, the fewer goods and services will be tradable, as it gets more and more expensive to travel to another country for an alternative. Specifically, economists have estimated that non-tradable goods and services could be as low as 22% for a big country like the United States. In other words, while it may be simplest to use today's dollar-euro exchange rate to judge how rich Europeans are compared to Americans, the vast majority of the GDP of both regions is not directly impacted by this exchange rate, because it is measuring mostly non-tradable goods and services. This is why instead economists often use the so-called purchasing power parity, or PPP for short, exchange rates, to compare the economies of big currency blocks like Europe and the United States. In essence, the purchasing power parity comparison of GDP looks at the prices of a representative basket of goods and services that includes both tradable and non-tradable goods and services. So PPP GDP compares the purchasing power that people actually have to buy most goods and services in their own country, rather than on international markets using the US dollar. Interestingly, if we use PPP GDP to compare European incomes to those of Americans, we will see that Europe is not falling behind where it really matters. Indeed, as you can see here, while the average EU and UK citizens' share of PPP GDP is lower than that of the average American, who works longer hours by the way, we do not see the same stagnation as we saw in the US dollar GDP graph. But why this difference? Well, since the difference between US dollar GDP and purchasing power parity GDP comes from how they account for both prices and the exchange rate, we would expect that either Europe's inflation and or exchange rate compared to the US could explain why Europeans have gotten poorer in US dollar terms since 2008. And as you can see here, after the 2008 crisis, prices in the US have gone up considerably faster than in key European countries. However, as we can see here, for the case of, for example, the Turkish lira, a high inflation currency should lose value compared to a low inflation currency. So given that inflation was consistently higher in the US than in Europe, we'd expect the dollar to have lost value compared to the euro. However, if we look at this graph, we can see that instead, the low inflation euro has lost value to the high inflation dollar. While in 2008 you could roughly get $1.50 for 1 euro, today you can only get roughly $1.12 for that same single euro. So while this graph is correct, Europeans are poorer in dollar terms, most Europeans have not really felt this because most of what they buy are so-called non-traded goods and services which come from the continent itself, where they do not use US dollars. This can explain why quality of life metrics that usually correlate with GDP, like the Human Development Index, life expectancy and reported happiness in Europe, are doing just fine despite dollar value GDP stagnating massively compared to the US since 2008. But then, why are financial newspapers and politicians making such a fuss about Europe's economic decline? Well, I think it is mostly a matter of perspective. If you work for an international company as a financial journalist, for example, you will genuinely feel poorer on your trips to the United States or when comparing yourself to your American colleagues. And if, like Mario Draghi, you are worried about Europe's place in the world that is rapidly becoming more hostile, dollar GDP also matters a lot. For example, Europe's new LNG energy imports will have to be paid for in US dollars. Finally, the fact that the dollar has remained so strong despite higher inflation could be a reflection of fundamental US strength compared to Europe, such as its cheaper energy, younger population, and better business environment for the companies of the future. So yes, people are right to worry about Europe's diminished economic strength on the world stage. However, with this video, I've hoped to have convinced you that despite a popular narrative, Europeans have not gotten poorer than Americans, where it really matters, the purchasing power of its people. Another advantage that Europeans have over Americans is that their data is typically better protected, even though that is only just by a little. Therefore, it still makes sense for anyone that doesn't want to become a victim of cybercrime to enlist the help of today's video sponsor, Incogni. You see, commercial data brokers are increasingly making money selling your personal information to a range of businesses. This may include stuff like your login credentials, residential address, and social security number. Having sensitive information out there in so many databases inevitably increases the risk of this information finding its way to fraudsters who might buy or hack their way into them. For many, this has led to increased instances of email, but also to fraudsters attempting to steal their identity, or to take out loans in their name, or to take over their online accounts, such as when a friend of mine recently and inexplicably lost access to his Instagram account, which then started spamming me. And although you can request data brokers to remove your data, the process is so intricate that it could take years to do it manually. Thankfully, there's a solution: Incogni. Incogni will contact data brokers either on your behalf or on behalf of vulnerable friends and family members and demand the removal of all personal data. They will even handle any objections data brokers might have, all fully automated. So, if you want to radically reduce the chance of either you or your loved ones becoming a victim of cybercrime, just visit incogni.com/moneymacro and use my personal discount code MONEYMACRO for a 60% discount to remove your private data from the market.